All right. So in regards to the Maya side of things and rendering the pine trees, if you remember earlier on at the beginning of the DVD, I had some quick times and I showed you a couple with pine trees. So let me just open those up. And so what I have here is a bunch of different pine trees that are exported from Onyx with shaders on them and some volume fog in the scene, just creating those light rays and stuff in the background. And so here I just have the camera just moving laterally. And you can see that they look really cool. So yeah, they're heavy. Like this one right here is, I believe, 1 or 2 million polys. But it renders fine, and that's really what's necessary to get it to look good. Obviously, since pine needles are so thin and so small, then you have to obviously have pretty high anti-aliasing settings to be able to catch them. But that's just the nature of the beast with stuff like that. So they look pretty cool. And as far as the shaders for them, you'll notice that it's really a matter of having different shades of green. So you can see this one's more of like a yellow green, while this one back there is more of a cool bluish green, and this one's more like a forest green. And so that's really the range that you're going to see if you just look at reference pictures of pine trees. So there's something called a blue spruce, where the pine needles are relatively low saturation and very, very bluish green. And so, but a lot of pine trees, like a Christmas tree, are more of like a deep generic forest green. And then here I just have one that's a little lighter in value and more yellow. So, but the shaders are really easy to create. So far simpler than broadleaf, because with broadleaf there's a million different kinds of leaves and you want to build your library. But with pine needles, they're really, in the end, you don't have to worry about cutout opacity, and so you don't have to worry about alpha channels. And it's really just a matter of making a decision of, do they need to have a different color along the length of the needle or not? And really, I don't really see much of a need for that. If you were going to do a super, super close-up of a pine needle, then that's a different story. But for generic, tree renders like we're doing, it's really just having a solid color. And so my shader in here is real simple. Obviously for tree bark, that's just a matter of having some good tileable bark textures, and I just do what I normally do and take that texture and pump it through a remap node to create the bump in the spec, just to break things up, and so you can kind of see that, we're still seeing detail in the texture map on that bark, and that's really just because I'm breaking up the specular highlight, or rather the reflection, and I'm breaking up the surface normal with a bump map. The other render in here is the same scene, just a different camera angle. And so obviously the fog's a little thick inside here. But yeah, so what I have in Maya is a few different trees that have been imported. So the ones that are visible right now, this one I can see is 480,000. And this one here is about 778,000. Remember, whenever you import an OBJ, that you need to make sure that you go to the attribute spreadsheet, go to render, and make sure that visible and reflections and visible and refractions are on, since they're off whenever you import an OBJ. And then shaders. So the shaders that I have inside here, let's go to Hypershade. In this scene, you can see I have just, a simple MIA on the ground with just a repeating ground texture. I've got just a single bark texture for now in here, so I'm taking a bark texture, which is being repeated, so I have the filter down at 0.1, and I can see it's being repeated 4 times in VV, so that's not necessarily going to work for all of the trunks and the branches, but it's just a generic start point. And then you'll see I have 2 pine needle shaders in here. And if I graph both of them, you can see how crazy simple they are, because I don't, in the end, really need to worry about things like, bump and spec and so forth. Really what I need to worry about is translucency and the reflectivity and BRDF settings. So if I go and take a look at, well, why do I just have these 2 gamma nodes? Because remember, if you want to put a solid color on something, since we are in this scene using physical sun and sky and camera exposure photographic node, I have to gamma correct things. So even if I want to put a solid color on my pine needles, I still need to gamma correct. So I can map a gamma correct node directly to diffuse, and then this one is being mapped to the translucency color, and again I'm multiplying it like we've done a few times, then on the gamma correct node, you can see I gamma correct the color to 0.454, and then right here I can just enter a solid color. And so in here, if I look at these two gamma nodes, you'll see that I have a solid green for the diffuse and then a lighter green for translucency. And so if I look at this other, or let's say, well, which one is which, I don't know. So this one, you can see it's more of a yellowish green. So lighter color for translucency. So a yellowish green as opposed to more of a forest green. And that's the shader. So if I go inside here, we'll see that I have the glossiness at 0.3. Skip reflection on inside is off because these pine needles have no thickness. Refraction, again, I'm using transparency to control that. So you can see I have it set to 0.2 for the translucency amount, which again is related to translucency down here. So translucency is on with a weight of 1. Anything below 1, you're going to actually have some, you're going to be able to see through the shader. So I want it to be opaque, so translucency at 1, and then the transparency value controls the intensity of the translucency. It's weird, but that's what we've been doing. And then, of course, I have my BRDF, which I can see is at 0.2 and 1, and so more reflective at glancing angles. And that's the shader for that guy, and for this guy you can see I'm using exactly the same settings in just this initial scene. And so if we take a look at a couple renders, let me open up render view. So these are the two trees that we're looking at right now, and I also have a couple other trees in this scene. And so with things you can see just the generic bark shader, and we can see that they look pretty cool. So like, I really like this one. This is a really cool organic look to the way all the branches are growing off. And creating a pine tree, or like sort of any of these with paint effects would be really difficult, just because, as we talked about in the paint effects DVD where we did pine trees, or I talked about pine trees, there's an internal limit with paint effects on polygon count. And so since a lot of pine trees need to start hitting, 1 million polys or more, it's just not very realistic to use paint effects for very, very heavy pine trees. So you can see that this simple shader that doesn't really have any textures on it, it's just solid colors that are gamma corrected, works fine. And there you go. So there are some other trees in here. So, if I go and get them all visible, then we'll see what the total polygon count is in the scene. So my polygon count in here is almost 10 million, so 9.4 million right there. And that's something that my machine can handle, so I can render 10 million polys, and since I know I can render 10 million polys, that means I can also instance 10 million polys, and it'll still render without a problem. So just a little bit of variety. We can see if I go in here, that one is 780,000. That's a little from the library. A little yew shrub, pretty light. This tree back there is 1.4 million. And then the heavy guy is this fir tree is 4 million polys. So if we go in here and let's hide some of the other ones and grab that fir tree and move that over here. I know, planes flying by. Actually, it sounds like a helicopter. This fir tree, 4 million polys. So, of course, if I zoom in on it, you can see that this guy has got a lot of stuff going on in there. And so let's just zoom in a little bit closer. We can see that the pine needles do not have any thickness, although we can see that the branches do. So you can see it's three-sided. We can see it's three-sided for that branch. Although if we zoom out really far away, that branch, if we were going to look at this tree from far away, I probably could have had it be polyline. Could have saved, probably quite a bit of polys inside here, because on this fir tree, I can see that the needles are 3.5 million, but the twigs are 546,000, and the branches are 1.25 million. Or actually, no, sorry, only 125,000. So the twigs are kind of heavy, And the twigs in here I probably could have set to polyline. That would have probably reduced the polygon count a little bit, but it's still going to end up being, instead of 4.6 million, maybe 4 million. So some of these trees are heavy, but if we just decide, well, let's render this guy. So we got that, save that, and let's do a render, just so we can see that fir tree. And I'll just give that a few seconds to render, and we'll be right back. All right, so there's that fir tree. So that took a couple minutes to render with Final Gather and the physical sun and sky. My anti-aliasing is obviously not very high, so if I go in here, I have it set just to one sample, or one max sample. And my Final Gather settings are set to my standard preview. So here I'm at 30.1 and 50, although usually my standard preview is 50.1 and 30. It doesn't really matter. Point is that, you know, relatively low point density, which speeds up the render time. But obviously, since the max sampling is at 1, in here, that just means that it's going to look, you know, a little noisy, just because we have these tiny little pine needles in there. But it looks pretty cool. And so, and also, like I've mentioned before, I've got my little reference cube for how tall a person is. So just this really, really nice, you know, organic breakup along the edges, and, you know, it just looks very, very natural. And this is obviously a pretty heavy tree. So, and here I just tumbled the camera around a little bit, so let's get back out here. And this guy again was 4.6 million polys. So, all right, so now that we've looked at just the basics in here, which is really just the fact that I have these, you know, incredibly simple shaders, let me see what other saves we have in here for Pine. So let me just go to by name, and let's go and find Pine 2. And also, I don't know if you noticed in there, but obviously my scene file size is relatively large for these pine trees. It's about 1 gigabyte for the scene, just because I have so many polys in the scene. And so that just means it takes a little bit longer to load. All right, so that loaded in. And what changed in this scene, I don't have any trees in there. I can see they're all hidden. But I can see that I created a ground plane that's emitting particles. So it's an emitter, particles, instancer node with those trees on it. So I've got 7 different trees. So if I rewind and hit play, then this is bringing my polygon count up to 271 million polys. And my particle object right now has a max count of 200. So I have 200 trees that are copies of all of those. And so this is just something that when I'm testing trees out, often even if I'm not working on a scene, it's just easy and fun to just instance them all over the place, just so I can take a look at what a bunch of them would look like rendered. And so let's do a quick render of the scene just to see what we get in here. All right, so that rendered. Took a couple minutes, and actually not very exciting, but just showing that our pine trees are instancing without a problem, even though we're at, you know, 270 million polys. But let me move on and to other scenes, just because I want to see. That was 02. Let's go to 03. Just so we can, you know, take a look at, or I can take a look at these different scene files and see what's interesting that we can talk about. All right. I just jumped ahead to Onyx Pine 05, just because the other ones didn't really have anything interesting in them. And so in here, it's pretty much the same pine trees that I had open before. And so really the only thing that is any different is in Hypershade, I now have 4 different pine needle shaders. And so if I take a look at them, we can see glossiness 0.32, 0.3, 0.35, 0.35. So making a slight change to the glossiness and keeping them relatively shiny. And then down under BRDF, we can see that 0.2 and 1, 0.3 and 1. So I'm increasing the 0-degree reflection, basically because since the pine needles are so dark, or rather so skinny, they were coming out really, really dark because the reflection that was facing camera wasn't very noticeable. So when backlit, they were just coming out a little darker than I liked. And so I found that with the pine trees, bringing up the 0-degree reflection helped in regards to the overall look of the render. And then also inside here, there's a slight difference in color between these. So we can see that this one is the forest green. This one is that sort of lighter yellow green, another light yellow green, and then this one is a very, very cool bluish green. And so this is more along the lines of the sort of blue spruce effect. So if I look at a render in here, this one took 7 minutes to render just because I set my anti-aliasing to 2, just so it would be a little bit cleaner. And we can see the variation in here on the left as far as color goes. And so I think it's a little bit more clear if I just zoom in a little bit. And so with these lighter green ones, I think that maybe they're, a little too translucent. So, and you can see that by bringing the 0-degree reflectivity up to 0.2 or 0.3, it just sort of helps with the dimensionality of the pine needles in the areas that are in shadow. So that is what's going on in here. So looks pretty cool though. So as far as straight exports from the Onyx library, I think that it should be clear that creating a library of pine trees to create any kind of pine forest or whatever will go pretty fast. So of all the different sort of projects I've been working on throughout the process of making the DVDs, I haven't actually done like a full-on pine forest yet. So I've mostly done things with broadleaf trees. But just because that for me was more along the lines of what I was interested in, although I definitely see doing some kind of forest scene with pine trees as the next thing. So I wish I had a really cool scene with pine trees to show you. But I obviously did take the time to experiment with the library and exporting and creating shaders just to see that creating pine trees is totally realistic and possible, and while they're heavy, they render no problem. So if we move forward, let's say we jump to Pine 08. Let's see what's in the last one. This is going to be the scene probably where I have that camera move and I have the fog. Other than that, things are going to be the same. But let's load it anyway and take a look. Yeah, so it's that scene. And so basically the pine trees that are in the foreground here are just my straight geometry imports with the shaders on them. And then these are the same trees that are being instanced onto this instancer node. So if we switch to another camera and look around, you can see I just created a simple plane that's emitting the particles for that instancer node that's just behind these main trees. And then that plane is obviously not set to render. So I have this rendering as my ground plane. And this plane emits the particles, but in render stats, you can see I turned everything off. So that plane's there just to emit particles, but not to render. And then, yeah, so if I go back to Persp, then in here, you can see if I scrub that, it's just a simple camera move in there. And then the other thing that's in this scene is just a big volume primitive. And so you can see I've got a volume primitive that's, volume primitives fade from the center to the edge. So this one's fading from the top, I have the center of the volume primitive on the ground. So the fog is thickest on the ground and gets thinner as it goes up. It's very, very wide, so it fills the entire width of the scene, but it's not very, very deep, and so that the front of the scene doesn't have as much fog. So scaling and positioning volume primitives just to put the fog where you want. And then in here, as far as hypershade, we're going to see it's the same scene. And so as far as just generic bark shader and my pine needles. And once again, these are the 2 camera moves I did inside this scene. And so this render that we're looking at is just the straight Maya render, rendered with the volume fog in the beauty path, so I didn't render it and composite the fog like I usually do for final projects or for stills, but since this was just a test, I just rendered it with the fog in there. And I can play that. So let me set that to loop. Obviously, I could have upped my anti-aliasing. I did this render with my anti-aliasing max samples at 1 just to render it quickly. And so that's why there's a little bit of sizzling in the pine needles. And so I would have to set the sampling to at least a maximum of 2 to clean that up. And then what I've also been using lately is unified sampling, which is a newer way of sampling with mental ray that works great for pine trees. So, and for things that have lots of small detail in them or very large complex scenes. So unified sampling simplifies the process of controlling your sampling settings. So when you have a scene like this, it works pretty well. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of unified sampling, but it is something that I highly recommend using. And so it's something that was introduced in Mental Ray, but not via the GUI in Maya, but you can still access it via string options. And with each the last couple versions of Maya, they've definitely been Mental Ray and well, NVIDIA and Mental Images have definitely been improving unified sampling in Mental Ray, which is great. So it's rendering faster, and again, it's really easy to use. But this render is not rendered with unified sampling. But either way, I could definitely benefit from upping the sampling a little bit. But that's not the point. The point is that we have some cool looking pine trees. And so I think making a little foggy pine forest is got to be on my list of things to do. So cool. And then this render, aside from being the straight render, I think I probably put it through After Effects just to color correct it. So just to boost the blacks a little bit and just make it look a little bit more cinematic. And the other render is just this other camera move. And so we can see how this volume primitive reacts to the scene light. So it gets nice and bright up here and fades out down here as far as its intensity, because volume primitives can be illuminated by scene lights. And we get those light rays in there. Which looks cool. And then going over to the render view. Let's see, file open. Let's see, Onyx Pine. What are these? These are probably just some different renders. So let's see, that's the animation. And let's go take a look at some of these. These are just different test renders. Make that small again. I'm just rotating the sunlight around in here and just doing different test renders. So I can see that that's a sequence. So in here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I just rendered an animation where the directional light was just spinning around and just batch rendered that. And so just it's a very useful and quick way to evaluate your shader. And so I like to do that a lot. So just because if I'm creating a shader for something, I need to see how it reacts to light coming from a lot of different directions. And so I just, keyframe the directional light spinning around and then batch render so that I can walk away and don't have to launch those renders one at a time. So, but this one looks actually kind of cool, just seeing the silhouette of all of these trees. And really in the end, what's awesome about it is, if we zoom in, just how natural these pine trees look coming out of Onyx. To me anyhow. I think they look pretty neat. So cool. That's pretty much all I got to say about Onyx Conifer. I mean, it's crazy easy in the sense that if you know broadleaf then Conifer takes very little of your time to get comfortable with because the UI is pretty much identical. And so I think that go through the library, export them, but you can see how simple my shader is just with the solid color for the diffuse and for the translucency color. And then finally just keeping tabs on your pine needle length, making sure you set them to polyline. And then finally, of course, remembering that under needle density, you can choose whether you're showing needles as needles or showing them as these intersecting cards, which you could then texture map with a map that has a whole bunch of pine needles on it. And then, of course, you would use cutout opacity and transparency. So for a small tree like this, where the poly count's low, and you would probably be relatively close to it, doesn't matter. But definitely for something like those redwood trees, we saw it's a difference between 2 million and 11 million polygons. And so that's where, for a redwood tree that you're going to be seeing from a distance, because if your camera's on the ground and you have this 50-foot tall tree, obviously you by definition are going to be seeing most of the pine needles from a distance. So this is something that if I was doing a scene with a whole bunch of redwood trees and I wanted variety, I definitely can see myself going in the direction of utilizing this option for any mid and background trees that would have a crazy poly count. But for all the trees I've been showing you in the renders in Maya, they're all rendered as pine needles. So cool. So the next thing we're going to move on to is going to be palm trees. And so palm trees, there's a little bit more involved in regards to talking about the shader, just because you actually have leaves again that require textures as opposed to these pine trees. So let's take a look at Onyx Palm.